Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. Fine woodworking often relies on components to be flat, square, and or straight. I'm going to share with you 10 ways that I use to determine if those pieces are indeed flat, square, or straight. Stay with me. I'm Rob Cosman, and welcome to my shop. We make it our job to help you take your woodworking to the next level. If you're new to our channel, be sure to subscribe, turn on that notification bell, and don't forget to turn on the notification on your mobile device so you'll know every time we release a new video. Good? All right, back to the bench. If you want to build really good furniture, and by that I mean build it to the absolute best standard that you can establish, you need to be able to work and be able to determine when things are flat, when they're straight, and when they're square. Now, I'm going to give you a quick example. When it comes to drawer construction, if you're out at all, you lose the potential to get that perfect piston fit. Here's an example of a drawer I did, and I actually had to sacrifice, or salvage, I should say, the front. That's why I still have it. But in the process of assembling it, when it came to the last joint, I cut this so you could see, but there's how much it was out. Instead of lining up perfectly, it didn't quite. And in the process of having to just move that enough to get that to line up, it throws your drawer out and you don't get that effortless fit. Well, I'm going to share with you 10 things that I typically do to make sure and to validate that each of those components, and remember, all it is just the sum of the parts. I'm going to show you how to validate each one of those parts are flat, square, or straight, whichever happens to apply. In starting this, I think we need to spend just a second talking about the terminology so we're on the same page. So if you take flat and straight and square in simplest terms, and how it relates to we woodworkers, I would refer to the bottom of this plane as I hope it is flat. All on the same plane, pardon the pun. My straight edge, this is where I want that edge to be straight. And straight is simply defined as the shortest distance between 2 points. So think about that. There's no turns, there's no wiggles. It's the shortest distance. It has nothing to do with angle. I want the edge of this tool to be straight from here to here. And then square, well, this is a true 90 degree, whether you're using the inside or whether you're using the outside. Now, in doing that, occasionally you want to take a look at your square. We often use them during the assembly process, and that means you may end up getting some glue on there, and it's not the most apropos time to be trying to scrape glue off while you're assembling something. So make sure you don't have any dings on there that would throw it off, any bits of dried glue. Check both the inside and the outside, and you also want to make sure that there isn't any dings along here that would prevent it from sitting or measuring accurately. So flat, straight, and square, got to keep those terms straight. So we'll start off with the humble square. In fact, I think about it, besides my tape measure, and I don't really consider that to be in the same category, I think the square is probably the most relied upon and used measuring tool in my shop. Not necessarily the 6-inch version, I have several of them, but in that category. Now I'm going to put my extra eyes on. Now there's a couple of ways to do this. I'm going to show you one that's a little bit difficult in terms of you have to have another reliable square. This is a Starrett 12-inch, extremely expensive. And if I take that 6-inch square and I set it on the inside, again, I've already checked to make sure there's no glue, there's no burrs. And I'm going to take a, lucky I have some half thou, so this is 0.0005 shim stock. And I'm going to put it in between the two, and I'm going to just push that over until it touches. Now I can't pull out that shim stock, so I know it's making contact. And if I go up here to the top, do the same thing. In fact, you see, as I pull on it, it moves the square. So I know that this is within a half of a thou. And you have to find what standard you want to work to, but that certainly is going to satisfy mine. Now let me show you another way of doing it that's perhaps a little more practical. So I've got a board that I use for a sacrificial board. And I'm going to check an area with my plane to make sure that I ran this over the jointer. I don't need a very big space. But using my plane on its edge like this, If I look underneath there, I don't see any light. Or you could use a straight edge to do the same thing. I just find it a little bit harder to see. That certainly appears to be straight. So I'm going to put that in the bench, and I'll just enough to hold it there. Where am I working between here and here? So I'm going to take a knife as opposed to a pencil or a pen. I'm going to set that on, hold that firmly in place, and I'm going to scribe a line. And I'm angling it somewhat so that I know I'm making contact right where the edge of the square meets the wood. And now I'm going to turn this over, and I'm going to look closely. I'll put the knife back in the mark, move the square over until it touches, and then follow that out and see what I have out here. And if I did the same thing here, it went right along that same line. So I like to use a tolerance that I take it to a point where I can no longer see room for an improvement. So I'm not getting a microscope out, but I am using fine tools and a little bit of extra eyesight. But if I'm using a tool that shows up to be that square, then I'm happy, and I think that'll serve me well. So that's a simple test to determine if your square is square. All right, number 2, and this is probably the most common use of a square. We need to determine if this edge is square to this face. But the first thing we have to check is to make sure that this surface is flat. If this is concave, the square is not going to sit on there accurately. If it's convex and has a bump, it's not going to sit on there accurately. So the first thing I'm going to do is take my plane and holding it on its edge like this, move it front to back, and I see the same amount of light peeking up there, which is the result of my jointer, but that, in my books, this is flat. So I'm going to take my square. I find it much easier if you hold it up with a light behind you. And the way I do this is this is the way I teach my students, so that you can get a more accurate reading. Take the piece that I'm holding on to, the base of the square, lay it flat against the face of the board, and then slowly drop that down and see where it first makes contact. Now, the far side of the board is making contact before the inside is. So this is, in fact, not square to this, and I'd have to go in and check it. But sometimes if you just throw that on there like that, it just doesn't quite work. So make contact, slowly drop it down, and watch to see where it first touches. Third test is one that I do a lot, and I do it a lot probably because I teach dovetailing a lot. So when it comes to cutting a dovetail and working on the pins, I like to teach my students that this only needs to be assembled one time and with glue. Well, that means you've got to determine, without a test fit, which often screws things up, whether or not pieces are flat, straight, square. First thing I want to check is I want to make sure that the bottom of these sockets are flat. If there's a bump in the middle, it'll prevent the joint from seating properly and you'll have a gap down here. So I'm going to take my steel square, I'm going to set it on there, and I'm going to move it side to side. If it rocks, well then I know I've got a bump in the middle. But as long as it's making contact with the two outside edges, and I don't mind if there's a little bit of a hollow, that still means that when this joint goes together, it'll be tight both along this line and in that line. So as long as that is nice and flat, things are good. Check this one, same thing, no bumps. Now I need to determine, is that face or the side of that pin, is that perpendicular to the bottom of this socket? That'll make sure that the joint will assemble properly as well. So I'm going to go in there, keeping the square tight to the bottom, and I'm going to just move it over like that. And it should make contact all the way around. Now I'm going to need my improved eyesight again. Sometimes it's a matter of just having a little bit of debris in here that you may not have properly excavated. If need be, you got to go in and clean it out. But keeping that down tight, I slide that over. And for some reason, this is not making contact at the top. In fact, if I look at my line, I see a little bit of material, so that cut was not made plumb. Let's go over and check this one. This one comes up the same way. First thing I want to do is check. Well, there is some debris in there. So I'll take my chisel and I'll just carefully go in there and remove whatever it is that's stuck along the bottom. It doesn't take much to throw this off. And we'll try that one more time. Making sure that it's laying flat, keeping it flat, moving it over, and now it's making contact. Yeah, that's really close. I'd probably let that one slide. Go over to this one. All right, there's one that's making contact along the front and top, so that's good. And come over and check this one. There's some debris in there. I actually see it. Okay, so there's what we're looking for. Make sure you're not leaning it over like that. Keep it down flat, slide it over, and it should make contact. These are the surfaces you're going to see, the front along the top. And as long as that's good, there's nothing you're going to learn from a test fit that you didn't just learn with the square. I like to use my plane for finishing. Often use power tools to get it to this point, but then to get rid of those ripple marks, I'll use my plane, and then you don't have to do any sanding. So I'm going to use the tool I already have in my hand, and although we've already kind of shown this a few times, we'll be specific to this function. I need that surface to be flat, and the easiest way to do it is to set my plane on edge like that, get down low enough so I can see a bit of light, and what you do see there is just the marks that are made by the segmented head on the jointer. But as long as it's uniform all the way across, then it shouldn't be an issue. And I'll run from one end to the other, and that's going to tell me exactly what I need to know. Now what I would do is I would start planing. And in the process of planing, I've got to be careful to make sure that I'm making uniform passes across the entire width of the board. And then as I'm doing this, to check my progress, I'll go back in and make sure I'm not making too much off on one side or the other or creating too much of a hollow. So this is a great way to use a tool that's already in your hand to do a job that otherwise you'd be using either a winding stick or a straight edge. Hey, if you like this video, we have more. Our newsletter has subscriber-only content, monthly discount on tools, and anything we bring out that's new, subscribers get first crack at it. Click on the link below. Let's get back to work. Now this is actually tip number 5, and this involves using something called winding sticks. And if you've never heard of these before, it's not something that would be common knowledge today because we've kind of passed that era when these were in everybody's toolbox. But what it does is it simply accentuates any wind or twist in the board. So your winding sticks have to be straight with parallel edges. That means if this edge is nice and straight, this one has to be as well, and the distance here has to be the same as the distance there. There's 2. The back one has some white inlay on either corner, and that's just to help so that you'll be able to recognize or spot the difference. There's a dot in the middle, and that's merely there to help you center the winding stick when you put it on. So I want to check this surface to make sure that it is flat, no wind or twist. So I'm going to set that right there. The dot's in the middle, and the front one is going to sit back here. Now what I do is I bend down and I sight along the 2 top edges. So I'm comparing this edge to this edge, and as I lower, I'll eventually see a little bit of this white and a little bit of that white, and they want to disappear at the same time. If I see more on one side or the other, then I know that I've got a high corner, and I've got to address it. But winding sticks will actually allow you to get within 1/1000th of an inch. It's amazing how accurate you can get with literally a hand tool. Number 6, if I'm flattening a board by hand, that's probably when I use this the most, or even if I'm just trying to perfect a piece, and I want to determine where are the high spots. And when you first start this process, you have to have a surface that will sit on your bench and not rock. If it rocks corner to corner and you're trying to plane and create this side to be your reference face, well, the board will actually flex under the weight of the plane, so you've got to get it to sit still first. And what I do is I use my bench as a reference tool. So I'm going to push the dog down. I do this in the area where I'm actually working the board, but I'll flip it over. I'll try to identify where a high spot is, and then to really identify it, I'll put weight right over top of the area that I think is high, and I'll rub that on the bench, and that does two things. If the bench is dirty, it'll show up as a dark mark, or it'll also burnish so you can see an area right there that has been worked. And now I know that that's my high spot. Now you'll probably find some other ones, but that's why it's important that when you do this, that you first identify where it's high, what's the most offending spot, and just focus on that one. Ignore all the others. I would now take that over and I would work that area, and then I would flip it back again and do the same thing until I eventually get to a point where it will not rock by pressing corner to corner or pivot like this in the middle, which tells me there's a high spot. So you can actually use your bench, and that's the reason why it's so critical that your bench be nice and flat. It is one of your primary reference surfaces. Critical to getting a good edge on both chisels and planes is to start with stones that are flat. And the way a stone works is there's an abrasive held together by some kind of a bonding agent, and as you run the tool over that surface, the bonding agent wears, keeps exposing fresh cutting particles, and that's what keeps the cutting speed up. However, at the same time, you're also taking your stone out of flat. So there has to be a process of bringing it back into flat. Now this is a David Charlesworth method that I was taught. And taking a pencil and just putting a series of marks on your stone and using them as a reference. Now I've got to put some water on there because I'm using a lapping plate. But I would wet both, set that on there, and I prefer to keep the stone in as close contact as possible, meaning I don't run way over like this or way off to the side. I try to stay fairly close. And if all the marks disappear and you know that your reference tool is flat, then that means this surface is going to match that surface, and that results, or is the first step in getting a really keen edge. But if I'm needing to make a wide board out of two narrow ones, I will have gone in and have treated my edges. I've identified with a triangle the way they go together, but before I put glue on them, I want to make sure that these two edges don't have bumps in the middle that's going to cause it to pivot. So on something small, short like this, I can put it in the vise. If it was longer, I would sit it on top of the bench. But I'll put one in there, make sure there's no debris on either surface, set that down like so, line them up. Now, when I move this end, if it pivots in the middle, then I know I've got an issue that I've got to get rid of. If anything, I want it to be a slight hollow so that when I clamp it, my edges are nice and tight. When I move it like that and I see that it pivots from out there, then I know this is exactly what I want. Now, I don't want a huge gap, so as I look down there, I don't see any light at all, but it's just enough to tell me that that's what I'm looking for. That should ensure a really good glue joint. So number 9 looks a little bit odd for a woodworking shop, but this is a Granite reference plate. I got it at a good price because it was broken in half. But you can actually buy Granite reference plates now. They're have become quite affordable. And I like to make sure that my tools are at a tolerance that I'm trying to work them with. So I'm going to, and one of my favorite tools along with this is a shim. Start again. Feeler gauge.
You ready?
Yeah.
Set, go.
One of my favorite measuring tools in the shop is a feeler gauge. In fact, I've even got, the thinnest I have is some shim stock that is just a 1/2 thousandth of an inch in thickness. Now, how do I use that? Believe it or not, I often use it when I'm doing my drawers and I'm trying to get that last perfect fit, and I'll use a shim stock to determine where, if anywhere, I'm actually meeting resistance. In this case, I'm using it in combination with a Granite reference block. Now, these are not nearly as expensive as you would think. They become very affordable. I got it really cheap because it was broken, but it's long enough for what I need. I like to make sure that my tools are at a standard that allows me to do the level of work that I want to do. So in checking the sole of my plane as an example, I've pulled the blade all the way in, but I have it under the pressure of the lever cap, so it's under what I would call working tension. And I'm going to make sure there's no debris on the bottom of the plane and nothing on the surface of the granite. I'll set that on there. And the idea is, whatever tolerance your plane should be under, use that size shim. This is 1 thou and a half. In other words, it's 0.0015. And I'm going to lift that up and slide it under. And if the plane moves like that, then I know that I'm within that tolerance. And this should be good to go. Now here's another way of using your plane as a means of determining if something is straight. So when I'm getting rid of joiner marks to make a glue joint, and I've used my plane to remove that surface, I need to know that it is straight from here to here. So again, I'll use my plane on its edge, like so. First thing I do is look to see if it was really out, it would show, but then an even better test is to see if you can pivot it. If the plane pivots in the middle, you know you've got a high spot. But in this case, it doesn't pivot, so that tells me that that edge is where I want it in order to get a good glue joint. Now, these are 10 things that I do all the time, and it just becomes part of the way that I work. But if you pay attention to these little tiny things, as I said, a piece of furniture is nothing more than the sum of the parts. Be really particular about every piece, and when you put it all together, your drawers will actually work exactly the way you want. If you enjoy my method of work and like my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos to help take your woodworking to the next level. I've always said better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the plane and chisel icon below, it'll take you to our site and introduce you to all the tools that we actually manufacture right here in our shop. It'll also give you information on our in-person and online workshops.